Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling kind of a complex issue,
Okay.
the relationship between guns and homicide rates in the U.S.
All right.
We're going to be going beyond just simple gun counts
Okay.
to see if different measures of gun prevalence, tell us a different story.
Interesting.
And trust me, the findings from this academic paper are seriously eye-opening.
Yeah, what's the paper?
It's called Identifying the Effect of Firearms on Gun Homicide, a Time Series Approach
Okay.
by David Blake Johnson.
Gotcha.
Yeah, fascinating stuff.
Yeah, it sounds like a really interesting paper. I
Yeah,
mean, it's a really knotty problem, right? Like, how do you isolate the impact of guns on
right.
homicides when there are so many other factors at play?
Exactly. Like, how do we know if a rise in homicides is because there's more guns or because of something else entirely?
Exactly. So Johnson uses this time series approach,
Okay,
which basically means he's comparing trends within each state over time.
gotcha.
And that helps control for those other variables
Right.
and try to pinpoint the specific influence of gun prevalence.
So instead of comparing states to each other,
Mm-hmm.
you're looking at how things change within a state over many years.
Exactly.
Clever.
Yeah.
But this paper didn't just look at overall number of guns, right?
No, you're exactly right.
Okay.
So he compared 4 different measures of gun prevalence.
Okay.
2 of those were the 2024 and 2020 household firearm ownership rates,
Okay.
or HFR.
UHFR, gotcha.
These are surveys that estimate how many households in each state own at least one gun.
Is that considered a reliable measure?
It's a direct measure of ownership,
Okay,
but like all survey data, it has its limitations.
that makes sense. What were the other measures?
So then there's estimated new gun sales, which
Okay.
is calculated using the number of gun dealers in a state,
Gotcha.
and national gun manufacturing data.
Okay.
And finally, new domestic guns,
Okay.
which is the number of guns manufactured,
Right.
plus imported minus exported guns.
Gotcha.
That last one's a national figure.
Okay, so we've got 4 very different ways to kind of gauge how many guns are out there.
Exactly.
What happens when you compare these to homicide rates?
Here's where it gets really intriguing.
Okay.
All 4 show a positive correlation between gun prevalence and gun homicides.
Okay.
But the strength of that relationship really varies.
Okay, so more guns generally do mean more gun homicides.
Right.
But some measures are more tightly linked than others.
Exactly.
Which one stood out as the strongest predictor?
So the 2024 household firearm ownership rate,
Okay.
the newest data in the study,
Yeah.
had the most significant effect.
Wow.
A 1% increase in the HFR correlated with a 1.776% increase in gun homicides.
Wow. That's almost double the impacts compared to the other measures.
Yeah.
Why might that be? Is it that household ownership is kind of a more nuanced measure,
Yeah.
reflecting not just how many guns are out there, but how integrated they are within a community?
That's a really fascinating possibility.
Yeah.
Maybe just simply counting guns, whether it's through sales or manufacturing data.
Right.
This is some crucial details about access and storage practices and the cultural context surrounding guns.
Right. It's not just about the raw numbers. It's about the story behind those numbers.
Precisely. And this is where we start to see the limitations of these oversimplified arguments
Right.
about guns and violence.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You mentioned a surprising finding about new gun supply earlier.
Right.
What was so fascinating about that?
So they used national gun manufacturing data lagged by 3 years
Okay.
to estimate state-level homicides.
Okay.
The idea being it takes time for a new gun to be manufactured, sold, and potentially used in a crime.
So you're kind of looking back in time to see if there's a connection between the number of new guns entering the system
Exactly.
and homicides 3 years later.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
And what they found was that the relationship between that lagged national gun supply and gun homicide
Right.
was remarkably similar to the relationship between estimated new gun sales and gun homicide.
Hold on. So increasing the number of new guns flowing into the country
Right.
leads to a statistically similar increase in gun homicides as increasing the estimated number of new gun sales.
Yes. And that's a powerful insight.
Yeah.
Because it strengthens the idea that the data is robust.
Okay.
This similarity in the findings across different measures lends weight to the argument
Yeah.
that there might be a causal relationship.
Between new gun supply and gun homicide.
Exactly.
Wow. That's a pretty significant implication.
It is.
Is it fair to say that this data suggests that those new guns are playing a role in the homicide?
It's a complex issue, and we have to be cautious about jumping to conclusions.
Right.
Correlation doesn't automatically equal causation.
Sure.
But these findings certainly make you think, don't they?
They do.
It raises the possibility that restricting the flow of new guns could have a real impact on reducing gun homicide.
Okay, so we're seeing some pretty strong correlations here.
We-
But before we get too deep into those implications, tell me about that robustness check they did with non-gun homicides.
Okay.
What did that reveal?
So this is where the findings get even more compelling.
Okay.
They repeated the whole analysis,
Oh.
but this time they looked at homicide rates for cases where guns weren't the weapon.
Okay.
And guess what? There was no real relationship between non-gun homicide and any of the gun prevalence measures.
So even though gun prevalence seemed to predict gun homicides,
Right.
it didn't predict homicides committed with other weapons?
Exactly.
What does that tell us?
It suggests that the relationship they found is really specific to gun violence.
Okay.
It's not just about an overall increase in violence,
Right.
but rather a specific link between the prevalence of guns and their use in homicides.
That's incredibly thought-provoking.
It is.
It seems to reinforce the idea that focusing on gun-specific interventions might be the most effective way to tackle this problem.
It certainly points in that direction.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah.
Let's take a moment to digest this before we move on.
Sounds good.
We'll be right back after a short break.
All right.
This paper really challenges some of the oversimplifications you hear, like in the gun debate.
Absolutely.
You know, it's not just good guys versus bad guys
Right.
or mental health versus gun control. It's so much more complex than that.
It really is. I think that's one of the key takeaways here.
Yeah.
The need for more nuanced conversations about guns and violence.
Right.
This research emphasizes that it's not just about the number of guns,
Right.
but who owns them,
Right.
how they're stored,
Right.
and the social and cultural context surrounding them.
You're right. It's like we need to zoom in on those details, on those individual stories to really grasp the full picture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this study gives us this valuable macro level perspective, right?
Yeah.
Showing us these broad statistical trends,
Right.
but understanding the why behind those trends requires us to dig deeper to explore those individual level
Right.
and community level factors.
So while this research suggests a link between gun prevalence and gun homicides, it's not a one-size-fits-all explanation.
It's not. It highlights the need to move beyond simple solutions
Yeah.
and acknowledge the complexity of this issue.
But even with all this nuance, there's still a clear statistical link between gun prevalence and gun homicides.
Right.
Does this research offer any insights into what we can do to address this issue?
Well, I think one of the most striking findings is the correlation between new gun supply and homicides.
Right.
It suggests that simply reducing the flow of new guns into circulation could have a real impact.
That's a pretty significant policy implication, isn't it?
It is.
It implies that we might be able to make a difference by focusing on the supply side of the equation.
It certainly does. And it brings up a lot of questions about how we regulate the manufacturing, importation, and distribution of firearms.
Of course, the gun control debate is incredibly polarized.
Yeah.
Is there any hope of finding common ground on an issue as contentious as this?
Well, I think research like this is essential for creating that common ground by presenting this clear, data-driven evidence.
Yeah.
We can move beyond ideology and start to have more productive conversations about potential solutions.
So it's about shifting the focus from opinions and emotions to facts and data.
Precisely. This study provides a framework
Okay.
for a more informed and nuanced discussion about guns and violence.
Right.
It allows us to ask more targeted questions, to test our assumptions,
Yeah.
and to explore different policy approaches based on evidence rather than rhetoric.
That's an encouraging thought, but it's also a little daunting, isn't it?
It is.
There's so many variables, so many layers to this issue. Where do we even begin to untangle it all?
Right. Well, one important thing to remember is that this study only used data up to 2019.
Oh, wow. You're right. A lot has happened since then, particularly with the surge in gun purchases during the pandemic. We've seen record-breaking gun sales in recent years. How might those changes affect these findings? Could it be that the relationship between gun prevalence and homicide has become even stronger?
It's certainly possible, and it underscores the need for ongoing research in this area.
Right.
We need to keep track of these trends, update the data,
Yeah.
and see how these relationships are evolving over time.
It's like this study isn't just a conclusion, it's a starting point, a call for further investigation.
Exactly. It throws open the doors to a whole new set of questions that need to be explored.
Right.
How has the pandemic impacted gun ownership patterns?
Yeah.
Have certain communities been disproportionately affected? What are the long-term consequences of this surge in gun sales?
Yeah.
These are all crucial questions that demand further study.
Okay, so we need to keep our eyes on the data, track these changes, and update our understanding of this complex issue. This isn't about finding a simple solution. It's about engaging in a continuous process of learning, questioning, and refining our approach.
Absolutely. This research is a powerful reminder that we can't afford to be complacent when it comes to understanding and addressing gun violence.
This has been incredibly insightful.
Yeah.
Let's take a moment to reflect on what we've learned before we wrap things up. This deep dive has really underscored how much we still don't know about the relationship between guns and violence.
It really has.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion only to find more layers underneath.
Yeah, it's true. This research is a reminder that we're dealing with an incredibly complex issue,
Yeah.
one that defies easy answers or quick fixes.
So as we wrap up, let's try to distill some of the key takeaways from our exploration. What are the most important points for our listener to remember?
Well, I think the most compelling insight is that simply counting guns, whether it's through sales or manufacturing data,
Yeah.
doesn't give us the full picture. The household firearm ownership rate, which looks at actual gun ownership at the household level,
Right.
seems to be a much more powerful predictor of gun homicides.
So it's not just about how many guns are out there, but who owns them and how those guns are woven into the fabric of our communities.
Exactly.
That suggests we need to shift our focus from broad national level statistics to a more localized, granular understanding of gun ownership patterns.
I think that's exactly right. We need to zoom in on those communities where gun violence is most prevalent
Right.
and try to understand the unique factors that contribute to that violence.
And that brings us to our second key takeaway, which is the crucial role of context. The relationship between guns and violence is not a simple cause and effect equation.
Right.
It's shaped by a whole host of social, economic, and cultural factors.
You're absolutely right. Things like poverty, inequality, lack of access to mental health care, exposure to violence all play a role. It's about understanding the complex interplay of these factors,
Right.
rather than focusing on any single variable in isolation.
So while reducing gun prevalence might be part of the solution, it's certainly not a silver bullet.
It's not.
We need to address those underlying social and economic issues as well. And of course, the other big takeaway is the importance of staying curious.
Yes.
This study used data up to 2019. A lot has changed since then, particularly with the recent surge in gun purchases.
Exactly. We need to keep asking these tough questions. How has the pandemic impacted gun ownership patterns?
Right.
Have certain communities been disproportionately affected?
Yeah.
What are the long-term consequences of this surge in gun sales?
It's like this study is a snapshot in time. It gives us a glimpse into the past,
Yeah.
but it also points us towards the future.
Yeah.
We need to keep our eyes on the data, track these changes, and update our understanding of this complex issue.
I think that's the real power of this research. It
Yeah.
doesn't just provide answers, it sparks more informed conversations
Right.
and drives further investigation.
And hopefully it empowers each of us to become more informed participants in this critical debate.
Oh,
This isn't about taking sides. It's about using data and evidence to guide our understanding and our actions.
couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive for today. But we hope this is just the beginning of your own exploration of this important topic. Don't be afraid to dive into the source material yourself.
Please do.
Ask tough questions and challenge your own assumptions.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
And until next time, keep diving deep.